Some of the people who watched my last video on my distributed log server asked for some details on how it was set up, the way it was architected. So, since I'm currently testing the next incarnation of my log server, I figured this would be a good time to do both. To show you the new one as well as the way it's currently set up. So this is the current setup. I've got two Elasticsearch clusters, one in the California data center and one in the Wisconsin data center. And the idea being I want to keep my data local to a geography. So I could add as many of these as I needed. We could, for instance, spin up a new cluster in the UK or in Japan, for instance. And then in each geography, I've got a syslog daemon that logs to the nearest cluster. And in my case, each of these clusters is really only a single node. It's a SGI UV30 with 1.5 terabytes of physical memory. So it's pretty beefy. It can deal with a lot of data. But if we ever needed to, we could always just add additional nodes to give it more memory or more storage capacity. And then I've got and the syslog daemon right now, the one that's running in production, is just a single process. It's running on a single CPU core. And even though we're dealing with between 3.5 and 4 million events per hour, it's only using like 30 or 40% of a single CPU core. So it's scaling nicely. And then we have a Kibana server that also is running Elasticsearch, but this one is configured not to store any data. It just knows about all of the other clusters, and any query it gets, it just passes off to all of the other clusters. And then it aggregates the results and then gives it to Kibana in this case. And then this would be me looking at the web interface, and that's Kibana is where I do all of my searches, my visualizations, my dashboards, things like that. It's where I go looking for interesting stuff. So this has been working great, but I knew that at some point I wanted to add some log analysis. I wanted to look for suspicious behavior. I wanted to look for sequences of events. And then if I saw a specific sequence of event, log an additional event. So for instance, let's say that the log server watches what machines user bbice logs into and what times of day he logs into those machines. And then at some point it sees that same user log in to a new machine he's never logged into before. That would be worthy of logging an additional event. Or maybe user bbice only logs in during the daytime hours, Mountain Standard Time, and all of a sudden he logs in at 2 a.m. That might be worthy of logging its own event. So if I start doing a lot of log analysis, I knew that running it in a single CPU core probably was not a great idea. So this is the way the new syslog daemon is set up. Each of these runs as a separate process, and the core syslog daemon runs, this is the bit that accepts the syslog traffic, parses out the syslog protocol. Every time it gets an event, a log message, it figures out which parsers are interested in that type of log message, and it gives it to one or more of the parsers. Now, as soon as it does that, it's asynchronous. As soon as it does that, it goes on about its business listening for the next log message. The parsers, meanwhile, they'll look at the log message, figure out what they can index out of it. They'll strip out things, well, they won't strip them out, but they'll find things like the source IP and add it to the object with a name, source IP, so then you can search by it or graph it. Or maybe they'll look for from addresses and message IDs and things like that. When they're done parsing a log message, they give it back to the syslog daemon. The syslog daemon then gives it to the post processors. In my case, I only have two post processors at the moment. One of them looks at IP addresses and tries to match them up with usernames and host names. So it does that by watching DHCP logs and VPN logs. So if it sees a DHCP event, it sees an IP being a DHCP server acknowledging a lease request from a particular IP and host name, it can then match those two together. When it sees a VPN login, it knows that IP is now associated with a particular username. that kind of thing. So it adds additional, given a log message that has an IP but not a username or a host name, it can add additional information to that log object. Excuse me. So then this next post processor does geo-IP mapping. So it knows all about the networks that I have and where they're located. So it's a lot more accurate than the geo-IP database, right? SGI's got offices all over the world, so I can narrow it down to give it information about specific networks and specific offices. And then if it's an outside IP, it'll look up at the geo-IP database and do a best guess to figure out what location that IP is. So it'll add more information to the log object. If it has an IP, it'll be able to add things like a city or a country or an office name, things like that. So then when the post processors are all done handling a log object, they give it back to syslog. Syslog then hands it off to all of the destination handlers. In my case, I have 3 at the moment. 2 are for writing to a database or to a file. So this one has, in the config file, it tells it different types of log objects go to different flat ASCII files. This one has some config options to tell it about what Elasticsearch cluster it should log the message to the log object to. And that's where the parsers are really handy, because it instead of just being a raw one-line string, it's now an object that has attributes like IP address and from address, to address, and things like that. And then the third is the log analysis modules. And there actually could be a lot of them. I only have one log analysis module at the moment, and all it's doing right now is looking at the Barracuda spam firewall logs, and it's looking for suspicious activity. So these log analysis modules, they're looking for a sequence of events, and when it sees something interesting, like in my case, if I see a from address that's posting to too many mailing lists, that's probably a phish or a spam. And so it'll write its own log message back to syslog saying, hey, a human should probably look at this from address. It may be a spammer or it may be a phisher. But the log analysis modules could be doing anything, whatever you can imagine and write. So for instance, I'll do one that'll look at logins and look for suspicious activity. I'll make another one that'll look at threat alerts coming from the snort sensors, the Cyforts, the Palo Altos, and things like that. Because then if I see a snort alert that might by itself merely be suspicious, combined with Cyfort alerts, that makes it more than merely suspicious. We should have a human look into it. So eventually I'll have a log analysis module that'll do things like that. Given a threat ID alert for a given IP or a given user, if it sees multiple alerts for that same IP or that same user, it'll log its own alert saying, hey, this is a higher priority and a human should look at this right away. So all of these processes are managed by something called PM2, which is really cool. I tell it about each of the different modules, and it automatically starts them with a single command and monitors them, so that if one of them dies for some reason, like I have a bug in one of the parsers or something, and it dies, it'll automatically restart it, and it'll log the error so that a human can then go and look at it and fix it. You can also set thresholds, so if it starts to consume too much memory, it'll automatically kick it and restart it. And it also means that now if I update a parser and make a tweak to one of the parsers to make it detect something that it's not currently indexing, I don't have to restart the entire syslog daemon. I can just restart that one parser. So that's convenient. That'll be good in the long run. It'll make it a little more resilient as well. Although I haven't had any crashes, it should make it a lot more resilient. And people asked about the code and how hard is it to customize. Most of the custom stuff, the things that are SGI specific, really are just in the log analysis module and the post processors. Everything else, well, I guess we do have some SGI specific things to the parsers, but mostly they're just based on, they're not really SGI specific, they're device specific. So I've got a parser for snort alerts, I've got a parser for auth and auth priv for login logs on Linux systems, that kind of thing. And the goal was to make them, the stuff that somebody else using this code might need to modify to get it up and running. I wanted that to be as simple as possible so that anybody with really rudimentary scripting backgrounds could make these changes. So if we look at one, for example, all the parsers consist of is three functions. So they need to have a parse function that takes an object, and then they look at one of the things in that object is a string, a message, and they'll look at that string and then add things to the parsed object. So for instance, I've got a bunch of regex patterns, and I'll pick out a username or a source IP or a port or things like that. I'll add those to the parsed object as that are named by attribute. And then they need to have a print object. That's just used for debugging. That's just a function to print out, given an object that this parser has handled. These are the things that it's parsing out and added to the object, to the parsed object. It needs to be able to print them out for debugging. And then there's a function called isMine, and this is just the function that the syslog daemon calls to figure out which parsers want to see that given log message. So here, my isMine function is just saying, I only want to see stuff where the syslog facility is auth or auth priv. And these are, right now, they're set to constants to the integer values, but I have a different JavaScript file that specifies all those constants, so you can actually pick them out by name now rather than just by the numeric code. But anyway, that's it. So they're really simple. Anybody with minimal scripting experience can figure out how to do string parsing in JavaScript and write their own parsers for whatever logs they're ingesting. That's basically it. I'm not releasing the source code yet. This is all stuff I've developed on my own time, on my own system at home. Eventually it'll show up probably on GitHub or somewhere as a node package. But I happen to be entertaining job opportunities again. So if you want your very own log server, give me a job offer or send me an email. Maybe I'll come build one for you.